The title of this lecture is Drug Scares. We're going to talk a little bit about the social construction of drug scares or the creation of drugs as a social problem. I've also provide the article that you see there. It's very important that you read this article, not just watch this lecture by necessity in an online version. This lecture is going to be much shorter. Also, you should read my lecture notes that are available as well. That'll go into much greater detail. Okay, so remember that we want to sort of what a drug scare is it basically comes from the social construction idea or theory in sociology, and it's basically social construction of um, the social construction of social problems looks why certain issues become viewed as a problem while others do not. For example, in the 1980s is when sort of the war on drugs really got going as a big thing. It was actually started by President Nixon in the 70s, but in the 1980s, it really sort of gained steam and became a big deal and um, had just an astronomical effect on our criminal justice system. So it sort of asks when we look at social construction of the drug problem, we sort of ask, well, why were drugs perceived as a huge social problem, why many issues were not? So why are some issues ignored and others are seen as a huge issue that require some sort of political attention? So like in the 1980s, drugs were viewed as a bigger threat to our society than nuclear war. And this is when the old Soviet Union was still a company and we were in the midst of the Cold War. People were rightly concerned that thermonuclear war could basically wipe out the planet. Um, Another sort of example is we could think of like why did drugs become a problem, seen as a social problem when we knew that as objectively speaking, the access to safe drinking water, electricity, and whatnot um, are far more greater concerns. These things that you see on the slide have obviously changed since that the date there, but the idea would remain the same, right? Still far, far, far. There are far bigger objective social problems that we will ignore while we're simultaneously focusing on one. Okay, so what social problems do is they focus on the social process that creates the notion of a problem rather than the actual problem itself. So, what are the social processes that take place to create the notion of a certain subject being viewed as the public as something of great, great concern? And so we will sort of go through the elements of what are described in that article, that how one is created, and specifically we will apply it to the problem of illicit drugs, but you could apply it to crime if you wanted to. You could apply it to terrorism. You could apply it to global warming. But this all of those other things, when I'm not saying that these six components that we're going to talk about necessarily apply to each of those concepts, but the idea of social construction, you can sort of see a common thread in many other social problems. Okay, so just so you know, briefly in the United States, we've had a number of drug scares, not just what one would call the war on drugs, which started in the 1980s in real earnest and continued to this day, really, at least on a federal level. Um, more, so the better way to look at this is sort of a drug scare. It's not that it looks at all drugs, it's concerned of the use of some drugs by some people, typically more marginalized people. In the United States, we've had scares against all of the things that you see there on the slides. Um, I would argue that we have also now, we've also begun to see in 2000, this is now 2021, but we've seen a drug scare of opiates in the United States, which it's kind of fair to say that whether or not it's really a scare might be um, a debatable topic because literally now more people die from opiates than die in car crashes. But you will see some of the elements, and I will try to incorporate some of that the best I can, but I'm not sure if I'll pull it off. Okay, but just know that we've had many drug scares over the course of our history. Okay, there are 6 components to a drug scare, which are explained in much greater detail in the article I want you to read. You can see there what we'll cover those one at a time. Okay, so notion of a new public menace, drug wars serve hidden agendas. They call for an increase in criminal justice involvement. There's a dramatic increase in social media coverage. There are undefined notions of addiction and disease. And lastly, women and youth are portrayed as victims. Okay, a new public menace, basically, in order to show a drug scare, needs to sort of create the notion that this drug is somehow new. Okay, claims makers, which are the people who engage in this social process of claiming that drugs are a social problem or anything is a social problem, they must demonstrate somehow that the drug in question represents somehow a new threat to the established social order. Okay, it can be a new drug, for example, ice in Hawaii, that you guys may have heard of that. But that was methamphetamine, and it was just basically a new way of ingesting it. Smoking cocaine had been around for many years, but it wasn't until the mid 1980s that crack cocaine, which was a new way to smoke it, that was much easier to create, became seen as a huge, huge social problem. Okay, regardless of whether it's a new drug or an old drug, this drug is said to be so powerful and so dangerous that it creates either a new breed of drug users. Somehow it takes ordinary people and turns them into vicious criminals or monsters that you wouldn't recognize. Or it does the same in terms of it creates a new breed of drug dealer that's especially heinous, especially predatory, that we haven't seen before. And the overarching idea is that drugs must be stopped or they're going to irreparably damage our way of life. Okay? So it can take many forms, but the underlying concept doesn't change. The use of this drug must be stopped or it will irreparably damage our traditional way of life in some way. Okay? Next one is that drug wars serve hidden agendas. On their surface, drug scares are supposed to be about helping people avoid the tragedies of drug use and their associated costs, but they often serve ulterior political, social, and economic, even moral agendas. Okay, and they can serve several agendas at the same time. They can be about individuals, public bureaucracies, industries, and/or political alliances. They can even have competing. They can serve competing agendas. So they don't serve one agenda at one time. They can serve multiple agendas, some of which are compatible, some are not. But they're not just, drug wars are not just about drugs. They're about something else. Politicians, public bureaucrats, moral entrepreneurs will use drug scares to their own purposes. So, for example, you take a drug war, politicians at one point, I'm hoping that it's changing, but in the 1980s, they passed a whole slew of additional federal drug laws, and that's because it was political suicide if you were a politician to be seen as soft on drugs. And so basically every politician of any party was hard on drugs. In fact, if you weren't, you'd be elected out of office. So drug wars served the interests of politicians because they portrayed themselves as being hard on drugs. They also served the political interests and economic interests of prison guards and police unions. I don't know if you guys have heard of DARE, which was a drug education program. At one point, you could see cops driving around in these fancy new cars they're really cool cars actually at the time, and they had a DARE sticker on the side. Tremendous resources were given to police departments. Prisons grew dramatically, so tremendous resources were given to the prison systems. Bureaucrats love more resources. Prison guards, at one point in California, my home state, prison guard union, it's the biggest state, right? So most people, so it has the most prisons and the most prisoners, and so the political power of the prison guard union became bigger than teachers at one point. I don't know if that's still true, But the idea is that drug wars are not just about drugs. They kind of get a life of their own. They can also be used by religious groups who, there is basically one brand of a religion that would say ingesting any substance or certain substances into your um, body merely for the purposes of pleasure is a sin, right? And if you want to, you can use that notion to support your agenda. Okay, so it's not just one agenda, there are many agendas. They can be competing agendas, um, but they serve all kinds of agendas that have nothing to do about drugs. Okay, in a drug scare, the dominant solution. So first of all, you say drugs are a huge problem. We got to do something about it. So the next question is, well, what is the social policy that we need to create to lessen our problem? In a drug scare, it's always, or it tends to be, I shouldn't say always, the dominant policy suggestion is we need to make it a crime in some way. Okay, so public health solutions almost always take a back seat to criminal justice solutions. So the typical policy is, well, if we need to have harsher criminal penalties. So if you already have a law, make it more harsh. So if you already had prison sentences for possessing a certain substance, make them longer. If there is no existing law, then that drug needs to be outlawed. That happened with LSD, which is a hallucinogen. It wasn't originally outlawed. So basically, all the drugs that you can think of that are illegal now were not originally illegal in the United States. But sort of another example of this is that, and remember I said in the mid 80s and 90s, it was political suicide for politicians to be soft on drugs. So, and also remember, drugs were seen as a bigger social problem than nuclear war. So people went to their federal legislators, their senators, and their U.S. House of Representatives, and they say, "What are you going to do about this drug problem?" It would have been political. The honest answer would have been, "Hey, I'm sorry. The way the U.S. Constitution was set up is that most street crimes that you think of are state problems, and so each of the 13 colonies had fully functioning criminal justice systems. So basically, all the 50 states have their own laws, and so you really shouldn't complain to me, your U.S. senator. You should go complain to your state legislators, and they can pass some laws for you." Okay, to say that would have been political suicide. You would have been voted out of office. So there was overwhelming bipartisan support where they passed in I believe it was the Drug Control Act of 1986. They passed a whole slew of brand new federal offenses that were usually, at the time at least, much stiffer than most existing state laws. So those of you who have known people who have done time in federal prison for various drug laws, in federal prison, that's the one that you see by the airport in Honolulu, that's the result of the 1986 Drug Act that made a whole bunch of criminal penalties on the federal level for drugs. There were always state penalties, for example, for possessing cocaine, but these new federal laws made it the penalties even stiffer. Okay, for example, one of the things that was in there, that 1986 law, was sort of this mandatory death penalty for drug kingpins. Okay, that was added into there. Okay, so again, if there's not a law against the drug, you need to pass one. Okay, if there's an existing law, you need to make it more stringent. Okay. There's also a dramatic increase in media coverage. That doesn't mean that there weren't stories in the past, but what happens is you see a huge increase in the number of media stories, both in print and video and evening news, about the drug in question. For those of you old enough to have been alive in the mid-'80s, you might have remembered back then there wasn't a lot of cable. Back in the dark ages, there were dinosaurs roaming the streets. And so if you watched the evening news, you would watch it from ABC, NBC, or CBS, were the big, the most popular ones. And so basically these anchors were household names to everybody. And literally the anchor of the show would like dress up in their little combat outfit and be down in the ghetto going, "This is Dan Rather on Crack Street." Okay. So there was just a huge, huge, huge dramatic increase in all sorts of media stories about crack cocaine when it was seen as this big, huge problem. Okay, the important thing about media is that the media, believe it or not, doesn't necessarily teach you what to think, but it absolutely tells you what to think about. Now, um, obviously, as we've had more and more cable news and more outlets, you can find certain news outlets that are far more partisan and actually, quite frankly, they start peddling disinformation and not actual news. There is good, I want one of the things is just a side note. I want you to know there are good news sources. Just calling it fake news doesn't mean it's true. That is a propaganda technique. So, yes, there are really crappy media sources and there are very good ones. Okay, but the idea would be when we're talking about good quality media here that actually sources their story and deal with facts, um, it doesn't tell you what to think, but it'll certainly tell you what to think about. So if you see more and more stories, those of you who might remember the ice scare in Hawaii, um, a lot of people started smoking methamphetamine in Hawaii, and you may have known some folks who had a lot of problems with it. Um, but what was certain is that on the evening news and the local papers, there were a lot of stories about problems associated with ICE. So, this increase in media coverage, what it creates is a new social agenda. It gets people talking about it, it gets them contacting their legislators, etc. Okay, so that's really the purpose. It's not that there's a single media story or a few, it's that you see a dramatic increase in media stories and coverage of the drug in question in a particular drug scare. In the opiate scare of the late 1880s in California, it was really pushed by this guy, Randolph Hearst, who owned a bunch of newspapers. Those from California may have heard of Hearst Castle. But it was basically an opium scare as a reaction to Chinese immigrants who'd been brought in to build the western half of the transcontinental railroad. And Hearst used it to sell papers. So there was just all these kind of stories about Chinese opium smokers and how they were creating irreparable damage to our society. So there were more and more stories. That's the idea. More stories. Okay. We also have the terms addiction and disease are used very loosely. There's two basic ways here. This, in my opinion, students tend to misunderstand this the most. So I want you to read my lecture notes and also read the article very closely, and I'll do my best here. Okay, so basically, drug use or misuse, we should say, is described as a disease. You have a disease. Okay, there's some serious problems with understanding drug use and abuse as a disease. It can be helpful for some people to kick their drug problem habit, but that doesn't mean scientifically the idea of a disease is valid. I have some articles I could point you to if you're interested, but I don't want to go too deeply into it. So one way is that a drug is determined is called addictive regardless of its physiological properties. At one point, marijuana was called highly addictive in the 1930s when it was made illegal. Most modern people would sort of laugh at that, but back in the day, it was termed a very addictive drug. So addiction is used imprecisely. In the crack scare of 1986, crack was said to be instantly addicting. No drug can be instantly addicting. Okay, you can instantly like it, but that's not the same as addiction. Generally speaking, just real quickly, in drug use terminology, addiction is a physical thing. So it means if you use a drug enough and you stop using it, everybody who does that, if you gave that to a bunch of people, have a similar set of withdrawal symptoms, physical withdrawal symptoms. Okay, so the classic addiction thing would be opiates. Okay, so if you've ever had pain pills from your doctor, like Vicodin. So long story short, if I were to give everybody in this class Vicodin and make them take it 4 times a day for a month, and then, or even 2 months, and then I were to take all the opiates away, your body would have gotten used to having it. And everybody, it wouldn't be exactly the same, but everybody would get some sort of withdrawal sickness. Now, the degree of sickness would obviously depend on a person's biology, but if you give a whole bunch of people opiates and you take them off, they're all going to get a similar set of symptoms, similar to having a cold in some ways. And obviously, the more you take them, the worse the symptoms are. Okay. The other idea that of a disease is I'm recording this now during the COVID pandemic, and so that's an actual disease. Okay, and you can catch that not on purpose, but just being around somebody who has it, right? So that sort of infectiousness of a disease is used in terms of drugs. So drugs are seen as being infective in that way. So by merely hanging around with the wrong people, you will somehow catch the disease of drug addiction. Okay? And so it's sort of, as you'll see in a second, those with are most vulnerable if seen as particularly vulnerable to catching this disease. Well, drug use doesn't work that way, right? You can develop whatever you want to call an addiction. I prefer the term you can develop a problem with drugs where you use them so much or in such quantities that they really mess up your life. But you do that purposefully. People, unless you are sort of kidnapped, I mean, the vast majority of people who develop a problem with drugs consciously make a decision to ingest that drug. You can catch COVID or the flu, okay, by not consciously deciding to do it. Okay, so that's how the notion of disease as an infectious disease is used with drugs, and it's imprecise and not true. But it's used as an image of these drugs. That's how dangerous this drug is. Okay, so those are sort of two ways to think about it. You have the idea of all drugs are addicting or instantly addicting, and then you have this infectious plague idea where people just catch the problem of drug addiction without meaning to, just as one could catch COVID or the flu. Okay, related to that is the idea that so women and children are seen as especially vulnerable to addiction, that what we just described. Okay, they're portrayed as victims of the drug in question. So our youth and our females need to be protected. They need special protection, in fact. There's oftentimes the notion of drug dealers lurking around schoolyards. That's why in the federal the Drug Control Act, I believe in 1986, don't quote me, but basically there was an enhanced federal penalty for dealing drugs within 200 meters or something, 200 feet of a school, right? And even if you lived in a house that was that distance away from a school, you were eligible for enhanced federal penalties, okay, even if you weren't selling to children, okay? But the idea, why did they pass that in the first place? It's because we wanted to protect our children from these crack dealers who were lurking around schoolyards, whether or not that were true or not. Okay? Women, and now it's typically white women, are seen as being raped or otherwise sexually debased by typically dark-skinned drug dealers, okay, or drug-using men. So in the opium scare in San Francisco, in the late 1800s, Chinese men were seen as luring women into sexual slavery. Okay. Again, read my lecture notes and most importantly, read the lecture for more on all 6 of these concepts. Okay, so there are various examples in both my lecture notes and in the article. The article goes in quite detail about the Chinese opium smoking scare in the 1800s, okay? And you'll see how all of the 6 elements can be attached to it. I will test you on the various elements, right? And I'll say, well, if in the 1800s, if Chinese drug dealers, you can see the white woman there in the background, and you can see the Chinese drug dealer there in his opium den. I could say they were seen as luring white women into addiction and sexual slavery. What is that an example of? And you would say, well, women and children as victims, something like that. Okay, when this is an actual movie, if you can find it, you should watch it because most people would laugh at it now. But marijuana was out, or cannabis was outlawed in the late 30s when the United States was recovering from a depression, the Great Depression, and there was a federal bureaucrat who wanted to secure dollars for his agency. And so what he did was created this social campaign against marijuana, and he said that it was instantly addictive, it was highly addictive. He associated with Mexican Americans. He said it made a black guy go crazy and rape a white woman. It was said to have, he used an example of this one dude, he was white, I believe, who was high on marijuana and axe murdered some people. And, the idea was that it was the marijuana that caused it. I think a modern person in the United States would laugh at that, but back then there wasn't a lot known about cannabis, and so they took that very seriously. I have some articles on the crack scare of 1986. I've done a little bit of it here in this lecture, but I have a wonderful article about the crack scare in 1986, and that really did help pass the new set of federal laws that currently exist um, in the United States. Okay, so that's the end of the lecture.